Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Compliance and Mobile Devices, the Forgotten Endpoint. My name is Allison, and I will be your moderator today. Our event is scheduled for 30 minutes, and we'll have a question and answer session at the end. If you have any questions, please submit it via the Q&A feature, and we'll get to as many as time permits. Today's presentation is also being recorded, and we'll email the recording to all registrants after the event. Now I'd like to introduce you to our presenter today, JT Keating. JT?
Thank you very much, Allison. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. I mean, obviously, sometimes compliance might not be the most exciting topic on the planet, but hopefully it will be somewhat educational and entertaining in some way, shape, and form for you. For any of us that have been in security for a while, we know that the basis of a lot of these compliance mandates is establishing a minimum security baseline for people to be able to adhere to in order to either protect data in the case of things like, let's say, PCI and HIPAA, or protect systems, let's say, in the case of Newark. And what we'd like to talk about is the mobile side of things. The presentation is basically into three chunks for those of us following along at home. There's a chunk that is, let's just talk about mobile and threats. You know, what's kind of the reality of what's out there. Then pivot into some specific compliance mandates and how it might fit in from the mobile standpoint. And then there's a brief part at the end that basically just kind of tees up, kind of how we address it. But I will tell you that that is emphasis on the word brief. The majority of this is going to be on the first two parts of that session. And as Allison mentioned, please feel free to send us questions. If there are questions that we know the answer to, we will provide it. If we don't, then we'll track it down and get it to you after the fact. But please don't hesitate to do that. So start off with just a couple quick slides here on something that pretty much everybody knows, but it sets up the reality of the current situation. This particular case is, we're talking about how mobile is the new PC, and how mobile is taking over, and just a couple of different slices at that piece of data. First one here comes from IDC, and it is the consumption. And as you can see, almost 2 hours a day for internet mobile, versus down to a matter of less than a half an hour for traditional desktops. And this is across all various different markets and ways, shapes, and form. And obviously the trend lines are almost as important as the data itself. And then if you want a different slice at it, you come over and you take a look at it from the standpoint of actual shipments by year. And again, the numbers are just staggeringly different. Last year, at the very beginning of 2017, is the first time that mobile consumption was over half of the internet consumption. So all the trends point that direction. What does that mean from an enterprise standpoint? Well, for any of us who have employees that are on that side of things, okay, that means I've got these new devices, these mobile devices that are accessing more and more assets in my network. It could be email, it could be shares, it could be whatever the case may be. For those of us who actually have any kind of mobile-facing apps, it means that, or apps in general, it means that those devices are out there, and we're going to have to start kind of deciding what we're going to do with it and how we're going to account for it. So clearly, mobile, for all the reasons that we know and love, is becoming the new platform. But with that new platform means, of course, that they're vulnerable to attacks. And Gartner has they have a space that they call mobile threat defense that we're a leader in. There's a minimum of, you have to be able to detect 3 different types of attacks in order to be a part of that whole bucket: device attacks, network attacks, and malicious apps. Coming from the traditional endpoint side of the world, we spent a lot of time focused on the apps. In mobile, the reality is malicious apps are largely for advertising and fraud. One of the realities of mobile platforms, which is a huge benefit, but also sets up some interesting challenges, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is every app is in its own container. And so in mobile, apps can't really play around and jack with apps like we're so used to in the traditional endpoint side of the world. So as a general rule, if I'm, for instance, if a hacker is targeting XYZ Corporation, they're probably not going to drop an app in the App Store and hope and pray that somebody from XYZ Corporation downloads it. That's not what they're going to do. What they're going to do, and what we see happening repeatedly throughout the world, is quite often they will start with a network attack. They will start off with a rogue access point or a man in the middle. They'll sit in the coffee shop across from XYZ Corporation until they find somebody from XYZ Corporation. And then what they do is actually compromise the device. And there's multiple ways of owning the device, which I'll talk about here in a quick second. But fundamentally, this is a very important point to know when you start thinking about mobile, and then when you start thinking about mobile compliance and mobile security. The objective, in order to remain persistent, the rules of security are still apply in mobile just like they do anyplace else. One of those rules is land and expand. So you always look for the weakest link. Right now, mobile is one of those weak links because it's one of the least protected and with the largest numbers accessing a lot of our networks. Rule number 2 is maintain persistence. The only way to really maintain persistence after reboots and things on those lines and still be able to compromise and do stuff is to actually have taken over the device. There's a couple different ways of doing that, which I'll talk about here in a second, but it is important to know taking over the device is first and foremost. Just some quick charts and stats and all sorts of fun stuff to just kind of reinforce this point. If anybody's interested, we're more than happy to do threat demos and everything else to show you. But here's just some interesting ones. In 2017, Apple and Google released a record number of security patches. Apple has done an excellent job with the App Store. And our data shows that the amount of malware on iOS is significantly less than Android, but it's still a computing platform. It's still vulnerable, and it's still susceptible to attacks. And Apple is still putting out security patches just like Google is. To give you an idea of this, in the last 3 months of 2017 and the first months of 2018, so basically in a 5-month period, Google put out 5 patch bulletins, which they do because they're on a monthly cadence like Microsoft is in the world that we're all used to. I don't have the data right in front of me. We just did our global threat report, but I'm pretty sure it covered 160 vulnerabilities. Apple, during that period of time, put out 10 different updates. Almost every one of those 10 included security patches for, I think it was 70 vulnerabilities. So it's definitely out there, and these things are high severity vulnerabilities that need patching. The patching side of this world in mobile, very different. iOS has got much more control over it than Android, but across all of the computing platforms, consistently 2/3 of the devices are out of date and exposed to attacks that are out there and that are well known. 10% of the devices that experience man-in-the-middle attacks. We actually had a 15% increase in that in the fourth quarter. So we're seeing that happen a lot. And as I mentioned, that's the primary mechanism to deliver attacks. And then Gartner has kind of weighed in on this and said that by 2019, 1/3 of total malware will be mobile. So as we kind of look at the pieces, it is very, very real and across the board. We have one other thing that we like to point out, which I'll do here in a quick second, on the kind of the ultimate stat of that. This is the threat matrix of the stuff that you're going to have to account for in your security and your compliance approach. These are some of the various different ways, shapes, and form that people are going about doing their nefarious business. As we mentioned, network attacks, man in the middle, SSL stripping is where they basically are able to take what should be encrypted traffic and make it unencrypted. Then the rogue access points, again, just very simple, where it basically says when your phone starts saying, "Are you XYZ Corporation?" it will say, "Yes, I am," and answer the question. Malicious apps, pretty obvious. As we talked about, mostly privacy and security risks and fraud. They do, though, usually have the ability to deliver exploits, which will enable one of the latter two. Privilege abuse is an elevation of privilege. And one of the biggest things we've seen in the iOS side of the world are these things called unmanaged or malicious profiles. For instance, there was a customer of ours down in Costa Rica that the guy went to a third-party app store. There are third-party app stores even in iOS, but you have to get to them by browser as opposed to directly. Downloaded a thing for a game. That installer installed a profile that enabled the hacker would have, because it got stopped by our software, would have enabled a hacker to basically control the device completely. And then we've got things like advanced attacks, OS exploiting, which is root access. One of the demos we do, and if anybody is interested, we can do for you anytime, is showing how easy it is to get root access on an iPad. And again, it's just as easy or easier on Android. So that's where they literally have super user root access, command level access to a device. So a lot of times when we talk about that, we'll say they don't have as much control over the device as the original owner. They have more, because you're never going to get that level from either Apple or Google. And then, of course, phishing is another mechanism that we see not only as something that is attacking mobile devices. We see it as a secondary mechanism. When somebody has compromised a device, they'll start sending emails and texts from the device. And that makes it, of course, much more likely to succeed. Some of those attacks can actually be used to deliver malware, for instance, ransomware, to traditional endpoints. So it's a mechanism. And like I said, land and expand is what it's all about. So punchline, 100% of our enterprise customers have detected mobile threats, 100%. The other thing that kind of goes behind this is, it's not quite as bold, 100%, but close to 100%, if not 100%, have detected threats that weren't part of their original business case. So we have some customers, for instance, that came to us for stage fright, which our research team detected and disclosed a few years ago, which was an Android-based device exploit. And they found that, but then they ultimately found network attacks or malicious apps. Another one, like the folks I was talking about in Costa Rica, they also found other malicious profiles that were decrypting all their traffic and sending it someplace else. So 100% of these folks have actually experienced the attacks. So the attacks are in fact real, which then gets to the topic of the conversation here. Okay, what about mobile compliance? What is kind of the essence of this entire thing? Well, the essence of this entire thing, as we're going further and further into this, is fundamentally starts with this question: what is an endpoint? Because almost every compliance mandate that is out there, matter of fact, every compliance mandate that is out there has some variation of the basic point of, if my data is sitting on an endpoint, you must safeguard those endpoints in various ways. And I always like to be very clear about all this stuff. Zimperium does not magically make you HIPAA compliant. No security company ever will, right? We each deal with our part of the compliance piece. So if there's data sitting on these endpoints, you need to encrypt the data. You need to encrypt it when it's in storage, and you need to encrypt it when it's in transit. Zimperium doesn't do encryption, okay? When you've got data sitting on these things, you need to make sure that they're patched. You need to make sure that there's antivirus software of some way, shape, or form, malicious detection software out there. You need to be able to report on breaches quickly, all of that stuff. Fundamental point is this: it doesn't make any difference at all from the standpoint of compliance and security, if patient data is sitting on an iPad that a doctor's walking around with or on a workstation that the nurse has, it's still patient data. It doesn't make any difference at all if cardholder data is sitting in a server or if cardholder data is being swiped on a square. If you're using mobile, and if mobile has any access to the systems and the data that are part of compliance mandates, those mandates apply to mobile as much as they do to any other endpoint. So what I'm going to do next is run you through every single compliance mandate. No, I'm kidding, of course. And again, reminder: send in any questions you want, and I'm happy to get to them. The key thing with a lot of these requirements, and I've got 4 that I'm going to run you through just as examples. I got PCI, HIPAA, NERC, and then GDPR, the emerging one out of the EU. They're almost all identical in terms of what they're saying needs to be there, because, as I said at the very beginning, compliance is a minimum set of security requirements, a baseline. And so it's the same baseline whether I'm trying to protect an HMI in the grid, human machine interface for those of us that don't play in the grid, or if I'm trying to protect electronic patient data, in HIPAA. So here's PCI, for instance, and as I said, Zimperium doesn't magically make you, PCI compliant across every single part. We don't do that, right? For instance, we don't do traditional endpoints. That's where you would go to a Silence, right, or a CrowdStrike or a SentinelOne, But requirement 5 is saying you got to have antivirus. You've got to deploy antivirus across these, and it's got all the various different things. You got to make sure it's kept current. Now, with the kept current stuff is pretty interesting because, for people like Silence and CrowdStrike and those folks, it's machine learning AI based. It's not the signature stuff that was around when the original requirements were being written for PCI, for instance. We are identical, as you'll see in a second, on the mobile side. We're machine learning based detection. But you need to keep antivirus on any endpoint that is processing payment data in this particular case. And then you need to do other hygiene things, like being able to make sure that everything is, what the vulnerabilities are, and about patching. What patch levels are. As I was mentioning, with 2/3 of the devices being out of date as a general rule, this is an issue. Okay, so you need something to be able to say, what is my state? What is my risk? What is my device exposure? Then validate that things actually, in fact, did get patched. And then I need to be able to actively protect against any threats and be able to report on that immediately. Those are the requirements that are identical on traditional endpoints as they are in mobile. And by the way, laziness is a mother of invention, not necessity. I somewhat lazily took these screenshots of these first 3 mandates directly off of our website. So even after the webinar, if you want to go back under our industry leadership tab, that's where we've got these compliance mandates, the specifics of them out there. Hopefully you're not going to run out there right now and just hang up on me, but I guess that's fine too. HIPAA 164.308 are the administrative safeguards. That's what they happen to be calling it. Again, I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but you can see the common theme. You must install security patches. You must have protection from malicious software. You must be able to log and send stuff back in. All of that is completely consistent, again, with to oversimplify, next generation antivirus on mobile, which is what Zimperium does. The NERC requirements, like I said, at the highest level, when I think about compliance mandates, I think of them in kind of 2 buckets. One is I'm designed to protect data, like PCI and HIPAA just were. The second is I'm designed to protect assets. I need to protect uptime and availability and the like. We're having a lot of customers now coming to us that in the grid where no, don't worry, they're not actually using smartphones to run nuclear power plants. But what they are doing is they're using more and more tablets, particularly on the service side of the grid, to have a lot of visibility and things on those lines. And so they're having access to some data that can be considered very sensitive to, to knowing the fabric and the framework of the grid if somebody had nefarious purposes, for instance, of trying to take it out. So again, for NERC, similar to HIPAA, it's under this bucket called administrative safeguards. But once again, you see the patches, the logging, everything on those lines. This looks weird. You know what? In my laziness, I just noticed that this is the HIPAA one. So I'll have to pass on the NERC one for a minute, but it's on our website. I'm just looking at this going, wait a minute, this looks awfully familiar. So I apologize for the lack of preparation. I clearly missed that one. Moving on to try and save some embarrassment. GDPR is a really interesting mandate. And for those folks that aren't familiar with it, it's really, really designed to protect personal information and give users greater control and visibility over where their personal information is going, why it's being used, and even if they want, at any point in time, the ability to have it changed, deleted, erased, to completely off the planet from any individual provider. So it's really a privacy mandate that's happening, and the fines can be pretty incredible. There's a friend of mine from the blogging world who just a little while ago wrote an article, and the headline says it all. I think it was Hilton Hotels, but I'm not sure right now. But it said, this Hilton Hotels was fined $700,000 for a breach. Under GDPR, it would have been 400 million. So, I mean, huge difference. Now, people always talk about, they got $1 million fines here and $2 million fines there. And, we'll see what ends up happening, but this is very real. And it is the beginning of May is when all of this stuff occurs. So anybody that's doing business in the EU has to pay attention to GDPR. Whether or not you're physically located there is not the criteria. The criteria is, are you doing business there? Under that GDPR, and by the way, GDPR is written very differently than the other mandates I was talking about, even the NERC one, which I butchered. The NERC, PCI, HIPAA, those were all very prescriptive. Like we said, here's a safeguard, you must do this. Here's that, you must do this. Very prescriptive. Put in antivirus, GDPR is much more narrative, and it's huge, by the way. It's much more narrative. But a couple of the key things are, organizations must consider the state of the art to safeguard personal data through appropriate measures. So organizations must look and say, what is the state of the art to protecting this data? And the state of the art to protecting this data is pretty much what's reflected in the other mandates we've already been talking about. I must implement measures to protect this, to protect the integrity, confidentiality, and accountability of that data. So, the stuff that falls into that from an endpoint standpoint, regardless again of endpoints, whether it's mobile or traditional desktops, you have to be able to do risk assessments. You have to know the nature of your risk. It's interesting, when customers come to Zimperium, the very first thing they ask us to do is turn on the lights. They say, look, I've got no instrumentation. I've got no visibility at all into what threats are occurring in my environment. You need to be able to assess your risk. You need to be able to, as we were talking about, know what's the state of my system so I can update them appropriately. I need to be able to detect any threats. And then in the GDPR case, they have a 72-hour reporting to the administrative bodies if they detect that there's any kind of a breach. So you need to be able to get that data, say, look, I know it's an issue, and pump it up as quickly as humanly possible. Otherwise, you're at pretty big risk. So mobile is the new endpoint. Mobile is being attacked. Mobile is being covered by these compliance mandates. I promised you a quick snapshot, and that's about all about Zimperium. First thing is, every security company is only as good as their threat research. And we have the best mobile threat researchers on the planet, a bunch of different things. They're inventors of a machine learning engine I'm going to talk about here in a second. They also, again, devices are what matters. Compromising devices is what matters. Our team responsibly disclosed more vulnerabilities on iOS and Android in 2017 than all our major competitors combined. So you're only as good as these guys. Our guys are not only good at detecting this and making it good for Zimperium, we are actively involved in the ecosystem, including the Zimperium Handset Alliance, which is designed to accelerate the deployment of patches through the Android operating system or Android ecosystem, and many others, including responsibly disclosing these vulnerabilities out to the industry. We have one core engine. It's called Z9. Z9 is trained in the cloud, but then is the only solution that actually does completely on-device detection of mobile threats. And not only known threats, but unknown threats as well. It is the only engine that not only operates on device, it's the only engine that detects device, network, and app attacks on device. Last September, we announced Z9 for mobile malware. And for the Android operating system, we literally are detecting zero-day malware on device. We recently blogged about a fake BBC app that we detected in one of our customers down in Australia. There was less than 10,000 downloads of it worldwide. If you go back and historically look at some of the information about various different mobile malwares that have come out, it's 5 million, 10 million, 15 million. Clearly, there wasn't machine learning being applied against that because the numbers were way too big. So we have Z9. Z9 is a core engine of ours. It can be deployed out in one of two ways. The first is basically the equivalent of all the next generation antivirus guys we've been talking about. It is called ZIPS, for Z Intrusion Prevention System. It is designed just like next generation antivirus. It runs 100% of the time on your device, and it is designed to protect that device and the data that's on that device. The second way we deploy out is we take Z9 and we have a complete SDK, software development kit, that enables us to drop Z9 inside of any mobile app to be able to detect attacks against that app and against sessions in that app. So, for instance, we have a major financial services customer. They're using Zips to protect all their employees, and they're using Z-App to protect their mobile banking software so that they can determine, hey, this device has been compromised. What do I want to do with that? Do I want to update their fraud score? Or do I want to alert the user they need to change their password? Or how do I want to deal with any of the things that Z9 detects? You can then decide is going to be now part of your protection for your mobile consumers or mobile partners. And they both feed directly into what we call Z Console, which is our administrative console. One of our big advantages is because we're doing all of our detection on device, we actually are completely cloud agnostic. So when companies are coming to us, they're saying, you know, hey, look, I'm moving to Azure. I like AWS. I need to go Oracle Cloud. We can work on any of them. Behind Z Console is a capability called Z3A, which is for advanced app analysis. This is where we can actually analyze any apps for not only the malicious part is being detected by Z9, but are there apps in my environment that are risky from a security and privacy standpoint? And then Z Console is integrated in with the most number of EMM solutions. And we've actually have a multi EMM capability. We can handle multiple EMMs in one solution. And we can put all the data into our SIM solution. So that is a snapshot of where we are. And again, I thank you for your time. The threats are real. They're real platforms. They're real endpoints. The compliance mandates are calling to protect them, just like any other endpoints. And we happen to be somebody that really enjoys solving this side of the problem for folks. So with that, I will stop blabbing and see if we have any questions.
Thanks, JT. We don't have any questions, but we've actually reached the limit of time. So if anyone has other questions they haven't submitted, please feel free to email us at webinar@Zimperium, and we'll get back to you offline. Otherwise, thank you all for joining today. We'll send out the recording tomorrow. And if you have any questions, again, please email them to us. Thank you, guys.